Good evening, everyone. It is so good to have you along for this week's installment of our Bible study in Romans as we're reflecting on God's gospel, a phrase that Paul uses at the beginning of chapter 1 to explain what this book is about. The book of Romans is Paul's thorough statement to the church in Rome about the gospel. Now, that word gospel means good news. And if you have been with us these last few weeks, you would be permitted to be thinking, where's the good news? It was especially beginning in chapter 1, verse 18, what Paul begins unpacking is the problem. Now, eventually we will get to some very, very good news, like chapter 5, verse 1. But before we get to the what of the gospel, Paul gives us the why. Now, sometimes when we think about the why of the gospel, we think about the motivation of God. And a verse like John 3:16 comes to our mind that says, "For God so loved the world that he gave." But whereas that does accurately describe the motive of God, it doesn't explain why God had to do the loving, why God had to do the sending of Jesus. And this is what Paul is doing in this first bit of Romans. He's giving us the big why. And the why is very simply the human condition. Now, what Paul does in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, he explains the why as it pertains to Gentiles. Then, beginning in chapter 2, which we're going to get to next week, Paul, in a sense, turns his guns and is looking at the Jews. Now, remember that this church in Rome would have had both Jews and Gentiles in it, predominantly Gentiles, but also Jews. And his goal is to show how both Jews and Gentiles stand guilty before God, that no one has a way of escape other than the gospel of God. And he finally summarizes that. If you look ahead in chapter 3, verse 9, it says, "We have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin." Now, the interesting thing about that is that he writes that near the end of his indictment against the Jews. But he says that he's already charged that not only the Jews, but also the Gentiles are under sin. And it's in this section that we're working on here in the second half of chapter 1, where this indictment against the Gentiles is the most focused. And so last week, we looked at, or 2 weeks ago, we started in Romans 1:18 and reflected on this challenging theme of the wrath of God. We saw that it's revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness, against those who have suppressed the truth. And so what we were reflecting on last week in verses 19 through 23 is how humans have suppressed the truth about God. Now, tonight we're going to be looking in verses 24 through 32, from 24 through the end of the chapter. Now, so 2 weeks ago we did one verse. Last week we did, 5 verses. Tonight we're doing 8 or 9, and then over the next 3 weeks, we're going to pick up the pace a bit so that we finish this season 1 of Romans, which will bring us to where Paul begins to unpack the good news in chapter 3, verse 21. So over the next 3 weeks, we're going to cover the ground, finishing chapter 1 tonight, half of chapter 2 next week, finishing up chapter 2 the following week, and then we will finish up with chapter 3, sort of the grand finale before we get to the good news. So tonight we are in Romans chapter 1, and we're going to begin in verse 24 and then work our way through to the end of the chapter. And so I'm going to share my screen with you now. And then I'm going to read the text. And then before I stop sharing the screen, just make a few key observations that stand out from the text that I want you to have in your mind. And then we will go to work on this. So let me do this screen share now, and we will read our text for this evening. So here we are, and let's go to slideshow play from start. And let's take a look at our text. So here we are, Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 24. "Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Now, there's a lot that's baked into this text, and we're going to work our way through it and unpack it. And if you've been with us, we could spend weeks just on this, but we're going to sort of hit the highlights tonight. But before we do that, before I stop sharing my screen, I want you to see these three slides. First of all, this one, just to review the picture of human idolatry that Paul has been painting. This is the primary sin. Like we just read, if you go back to this list, there's this list of all kinds of sins there. But the big idea in this bit of Romans is that the primary sin is idolatry. And we'll be looking at that briefly, but verse 21, although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. And one of the ways that we see idolatry playing out is these various kinds of exchange. And so verse 21, they're not giving God honor. Verse 23, they exchange the glory of the immortal God for images. Verse 25, they exchange the truth about God for a lie. Verses 27 and 28, women exchanged natural relations, men gave up natural relations. And so from the human side, there's this series of human behaviors that at its core is an exchange. And unfortunately for humanity, the exchange, if we start with God and we're giving God up, anything else that we're exchanging God for is a step down. And so it all begins with suppressing the truth that God has made available. We suppress that truth and then make this series of exchanges, and it doesn't end well. And so that's what humans are doing. But then there's three verses that describe what God is doing. And this is God's judgment being manifest through this little phrase, giving them up. And we're going to look at that and what that means. But verse 24, therefore God gave them up. Verse 26, for this reason God gave them up. Verse 28, God gave them up. So as we work our way through this text, we see that underneath it all, there is human idolatry, humans exchanging God for that which is not God, humans exchanging creator for creation, humans exchanging truth for a lie, and God simultaneously releasing or giving us up. And so those are some of the big ideas that we're going to see as we walk through this. And just want to walk through it verse by verse, and then we'll conclude with some overarching comments here. So starting in verse 24, it says, therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Now, this theme of sexual immorality is one that runs through this passage. Again, the primary sin that's here is idolatry, and that even in this next verse where Paul explains why this immorality is happening, it's rooted in idolatry. And so the first God giving them up is in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. Some translations, the Greek word could be translated there as uncleanness. Now, when Paul uses that word uncleanness, it's almost always associated with sexual immorality. And if you go to our website and download the notes, if you go to the Romans Bible Study, you can get the notes. And at the end of the notes, what I did, I went through various places in the New Testament where there are vice lists or sin lists, like the one that's at the end of this chapter. And I'll comment on that when we get to it. But one of the interesting things, if you go through and look at these, you'll see that this word impurity is often, it doesn't just mean unclean in a ceremonial sense or in a physical sense, but it's associated with sexual immorality. So part of God giving them up is in the lusts of their hearts. And so that lust of the heart is desire. And so one of the worst things God can do is to say, okay, I give you up. I let you have what you want. Now, this brings up, and we don't have time to fully unpack this, but now conversation to have, there's several different things God giving up. And so you can boat, untie the dock, then untie the boat from the dock, then the current of the river just carries the boat away. And this picture is a little bit like that, except that in the Greek, this giving up it implies more than just a release, but it's like God's giving it a nudge. It's like, okay, have it your way. And the having it your way, we love as humans, we love to argue for our own freedom of will, our own autonomy, but our will being controlled by our sinful nature without God's grace, without God breaking in, the thing that's in our hearts, the thing that we choose is desires that go contrary to the will, the law of God. And so that's what happens here. God says, okay, have it your way. And the will choose is to go in a way that's contrary to the way of God. And so here the result is impurity, which implies sexual immorality. And then he explains it further to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. And even that phrase, just briefly comment that what humans aren't bothered by, it's dishonoring in the sense of this is not what God originally created us for. There's lots of behaviors that we would accept as normal that God looks at based on original intention and says that is a dishonoring thing. It would be something like, but much worse than this. You could imagine some potter making a gloriously beautiful piece of pottery that should be sat on a mantle in a royal palace. It's that beautiful and glorious, and that's what it's designed for. But then someone not being able to perceive that value, taking it and using it as a bedpan, that would be dishonoring something that had been originally created for something else. Well, this is what humans do. What Paul is arguing, this is what we do with our bodies when we walk away from God's intention. Now, Paul explains this big dynamic in verse 25 when he says, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. And so the because there is linking, again, it's an explanatory thing. This is why this is happening. There's this underlying current of idolatry, which is when we give primary importance to anything other than God. Now, when we use that word idolatry, it's easy for us to picture people back in Greco-Roman times offering sacrifices to literal physical idols, these pagan temples with some idol of Zeus in there. I remember being in Nepal and getting up early and watching people come in and give offerings to little shrines that had little statues of Buddha in them. And so it's easy for us to think of that kind of idolatry. That's what's happening here. No, idolatry is when we make anything other than God ultimate and most important. And so here in verse 25, this is part of this idolatry. Number one, exchanging the truth about God for a lie. So the truth that he's referencing here isn't the full truth of the gospel. It's simply the truth that we looked at last week that is been revealed. And so verse 20 says, for his invisible attributes, his eternal power, divine nature have been clearly perceived because God built it into creation. That's the truth that in verse 18 is being suppressed. And here it's been exchanged for a lie. I would suggest one of the fundamental lies that is told about God, or that's believed about God, is that God is not creator. The doctrine of creation, the fact that God created ex nihilo, God created all that is out of nothing, is fundamental and foundational. This is one of the lies. We Because if we can come up with a philosophy, if we can come up with an idea that somehow God didn't create us, then we end up autonomous. We can choose to be our own gods, our own kings, our own lords, our own masters, the bosses of us, if we can find a way to get rid of God. So if we can somehow rationally, scientifically come up with a way to get rid of God, then we think we've done ourselves a favor. And so remember, Paul is writing this nearly 2,000 years ago. And so this isn't just some recent concoction humans have come up with. We're always trying to exchange truth about God for a lie. And the result of that, worshiping and serving the creature rather than the creator who is blessed forever. Amen. Now, I would suggest that this is perhaps the fundamental temptation that faces every human. We are perpetually tempted, and we want to. It's not like it's just an outside force. Our will, we want to, we choose to give up what's eternal and embrace what's temporary. And that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden and everything. This is why in Psalm 90, Moses prays, Lord, give us a heart of wisdom. And the way that he asks for a heart of wisdom is teach us to number our days. In other words, Lord, help me understand eternity. Help me reason about this temporary life in the perspective of eternity, but we tend to reverse it. And so we give up the creator, we give up the eternal for that which is temporary. And we've all done this. And you use money on something, you buy something because you want it in the moment, and then it's either lousy and falls apart, or it's something that you ate and now it's completely gone. And so humans do that all the time. And then Paul throws in this little, who is blessed forever, amen. It's like he's so depressed talking about human darkness that he just has to have a moment of praise reflecting on God, and this idea that actually God is blessed forever. In other words, God is the eternal one. So Paul sets up this whole section by, first of all, pointing about this direction that God gives us up to lust, to our own desires, and that those desires are often related to sexual immorality, to impurity, which dishonors our bodies. And then he underlines again this theme of idolatry. So with that in the background, now we come to verses 26 and 27. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for that which are contrary to nature. And men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, there's a lot going on in these two verses, but to just look at it from a bit of a distance, it's not complicated to understand. And actually, most of this section is not conceptually difficult. This bit of Romans is not theologically dense. It's just that sometimes we don't like it. But I think what Paul is arguing here is quite clear. Again, verse 26, God is giving them up. And then we see this exchange. Women exchanging natural relations, men likewise giving up natural relations. Now, one of the critiques that sometimes comes against these two verses are what's wrapped up in this idea of natural. And so one interpretation of this is that natural simply means the way that things are in certain societies, sort of the normal way of doing things. And that's not what Paul is arguing here at all. The giving up is described here as dishonorable passions. In other words, this thing is being used in a way that God did not design it for. And the fundamental issue really at stake there, that again just marks our human sinfulness, is this, that this is an example of boundary crossing. This exchange, this where we are transgressing. Now, that word transgression is one of the words in the Bible for sin, and it simply means to cross a boundary. And this is something that's deeply built into our human sinfulness. We love to cross boundaries, and actually we resist the idea that God has the authority to cross a boundary. I remember talking with a college student, and I said, well, look, yeah, it sounds to me like you're just trying to cross a boundary. And she said, oh, yeah, there are always boundaries to be crossed. And this idea that God sets boundaries goes all the way back into creation. God separates light and dark, day and night, land and sea, and female. These are categories of distinction established by God, and it is sinful or wrong or crossing a boundary to tamper with these distinctions that God in his own authority has established. And so that's what's happening here. And these are what Paul calls these dishonorable passions. Now, one of the phrases that gets asked about or interpreted different ways sometimes is the very last sentence there, receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Sin always includes its own penalty. Sin comes in a sense with two penalties. There's the penalty of whatever the thing is in itself. And then there is the ultimate judgment, the final judgment that we receive for that. And so that can be accurately interpreted both that the thing that they're doing in itself brings with it a kind of penalty, but anytime we transgress the law of God, then we are setting ourselves up for judgment. So in verses 26 and 27, Paul's just giving an example of the kind of dishonorable passion that humans give themselves up to as they abandon God. But it doesn't stop there. Actually, if you say, okay, that's not me, I'm not doing 26 and 27. Again, put your seatbelt on and go to the notes and read the list. Human sinfulness is so broad that the point Paul ultimately makes is that we're all guilty. You can't read any of these and say, oh, that one's not me, because there is one that finds you out. And remembering that the big sin in all of this is human idolatry, this pushing against God's setting, whether it's truth, whether it's sexuality, whether it's morality, whether it's what we worship, that he is the only uncreated being and that everything else is creation. This is all about idolatry. So then we come to verse 28. And since these Gentiles, those who have been on this journey, those who have suppressed the truth, they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. Now, what he had just been describing in verses 26 and 27, that ought not to be done, but now he's getting ready to explain a whole lot more. Now, the comment that I want to make before we just look at this list is this little phrase, gave them up to a debased mind. Several times in this passage so far, one of the effects of sin is what it does to the human mind. Now, the technical theological term for this is the noetic effect of the fall. Now, that comes from the Greek word gnosis, which is the word from which we get the word knowledge. And so that's what it is, that the fall of humanity into sinfulness, our sin, distorts our ability to accurately perceive the truth. In other words, no sinful human is objective in the way that we interact with reality and in our ability to perceive truth. And so back up in a previous verse up here, it says in verse 21 that although they knew God, they did not honor him as God, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. And so part of the result of idolatry, part of the result of this walking away from God is futile thinking and darkened understanding. And then here in verse 28, this third description that is describing the human mind is that God gave them up based mind. Now, debased simply means worthless. And the picture goes back to, again, at Roman times, one of the ways that some of the later Caesars would raise taxes and sort of temporarily get more money is that they would debase the currency. The way that you debase a currency is by mixing in impurity. And so if you have a coin that's 90% gold, and you debase it, you take some other kind of cheap metal, some iron or something, and mix that in, and you take it from like 100% gold down to 80%, or from 90% down to 50%. So you have debased it. So now you can mint it cheaper, but it actually is worth less. And so Paul's using this picture of a debased currency to say, this is what happens to the human mind. We end up debating worth. A lot of that word is being described here. We can't even tell the difference between creator and creation. We can't tell the difference between truth and untruth. Our minds, compared with how they're originally created by God, our minds are worthless. Now, I know some people, and there's some rooms I walk into, and I think, wow, these folk are really smart. But even the smartest people that we would meet, compared with God's intention, our minds have been incredibly debased. And then he goes on and describes all these things that ought not to be done. They're filled, verse 29, all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. Now, some of those are just quite general there. And then he comes on, they're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossips, slanders, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. You know, in the Greek, those last four, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless, there's a certain cadence there that is an appropriate ending to this in the way that it sounds. Now, just a couple of comments on this as we are wrapping this up. First of all, the thing that strikes me as I read this list are some of what seems to be discongruent. I mean, he's got boasting in there. He's got disobedience to parents right along with So what Paul's saying here is that all of these things come out of this human sinfulness. Now, the one thing I want to notice, and then we'll wrap up with verse 32, is right in the middle of this, it says, haters of God. That is the natural conclusion of what began in verse 18 with suppressing the truth. This human journey, we can't end up in a neutral place where we say, well, I don't love God, I don't worship God, but I don't hate God. Well, actually, you end up having to hate God when you understand God in his godness. The natural result of suppressing the truth and worshiping, serving creation rather than creator is hating God. And then you wrap up in verse 32, which says, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Now, there are two things to notice there. First of all, this idea that in the human heart, in our conscience, we know that those who practice these things deserve to die. That's a radical thought. And next week, we actually have a section where we're going to talk about the human conscience. We're going to look at what it is, what its purpose is, and some of the limitations around it. We're going to see that it's an important but flawed function. But then the next thing is that they not only do these, but they give approval to those who practice them. And this utterly describes the age that we live in. This age is not content to say live and let live. This age is not content to say, I want to go live in my own rebellion, but you're completely fine. You go live for God and do whatever you want to. No, we live in an age that is not content to be sinful in isolation. It must grab others and say, actually, your rebellion against God is fine. We can think of it like this. The road to hell is paved with people patting you on the back saying, you're doing fine. Every step you take away from God, someone's going to be there saying, that's great. You're doing the right thing. That's the way to throw off those constraints. Who needs a God who's trying to bog you down? Now, as we come into the gospel, we begin to understand that God's agenda for us is not slavery, but freedom. And what we come to understand is that all these things that Paul is describing here are not freedom, but the slavery into which we have been born. To quote a line from the film Matrix, you have been born into a prison you cannot see, taste, touch, or smell. That's sin. We have been born this way, and this is the world that we live in. And so, as dark as this is, there is good news that's coming. So I would encourage you to go to our website and download the Bible study. We have flown through this tonight. Sorry for those technical difficulties along the way, but we've flown through this tonight, and I'd encourage you to go download the notes where you can study this and read it in more thoroughly. In preparation for next week, read Romans chapter 2, verses 1 through 16. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. God bless.